The piano player struck the first chords of a melancholy tune, and Margot Fletcher felt the familiar weight settle over her shoulders like a worn shawl as she stepped onto the small stage at the back of the Red Canyon Saloon in White Oaks, New Mexico, knowing that another night of being looked through rather than at was about to begin. It was the summer of 1882, and the silver boom had brought men from every corner of the territory to this dusty town nestled in the Jicarilla Mountains. They came for fortune, for escape, for the promise of something better than whatever they had left behind. Margot had come for similar reasons 3 years ago, though her story was one she kept locked away in the deepest corners of her heart. She had been 18 then, fleeing an arranged marriage to a cruel man twice her age in Santa Fe, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a voice her mother had once told her was pretty enough to earn her keep. The Red Canyon was owned by a man named Theodore Gaines, a portly fellow with a thick mustache and shrewd eyes who saw his saloon girls as little more than fixtures to draw in customers. Margot sang, served drinks, and smiled until her cheeks ached, all while men looked past her face to assess other attributes or looked straight through her as if she were made of glass. They whistled and hollered, called out crude suggestions, threw coins at her feet like she was a trained animal performing tricks. But they never really saw her. Not the parts that mattered. She was 21 now, with dark auburn hair that caught the lamplight and eyes the color of sage after a rainstorm. Her face had been called pretty by some, beautiful by others when they were deep in their cups, but Margot had learned that beauty was just another commodity in a place like this, valued only for what it could extract from a man's pocket. She longed for something she could not quite name, some recognition that she was more than painted lips, and a borrowed dress cut low enough to be indecent by church standards. Tonight the saloon was particularly crowded. Word had spread that a cattle drive was passing through, and the cowboys were flush with months of wages burning holes in their pockets. Margot moved through her first song with practiced ease, her voice carrying over the noise of gambling, drinking, and boisterous conversation. She sang of lost love and distant homes, of promises broken and dreams deferred, and the irony of performing such songs in a place where sentiment was drowned in whiskey was not lost on her. When the song ended, she descended from the stage to work the floor, carrying a tray of drinks and deflecting wandering hands with the skill of long practice. A man grabbed her wrist as she passed, his breath reeking of rot-gut whiskey. "Give us a smile, darling," he slurred, his companions laughing at his boldness. Margot fixed the well-worn smile on her face and gently extracted her wrist. "You will have to settle for the whiskey, sir. Smiles cost extra." This brought more laughter, and she moved away before the situation could escalate. Theodore did not tolerate his girls causing trouble, even when the trouble came looking for them. She had seen other women dismissed for less, cast out into a world that had even fewer opportunities for fallen women than it did for saloon singers. She was refilling drinks at a corner table when she felt it, that peculiar sensation of being watched. Not the usual leering assessment she had grown accustomed to, but something different, something that made the fine hairs on the back of her neck stand at attention. Margot turned slowly, scanning the crowded room, and her eyes locked with those of a man standing just inside the doorway. He was tall, lean in the way of men who spent their lives in the saddle, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that needed cutting. But it was his eyes that caught her, held her, made her forget to breathe for a moment. They were a startling blue-gray, like storm clouds gathering over the mountains, and they were looking directly at her. Not at her neckline, not at her figure, not through her to something more interesting beyond. At her face, her eyes, as if he were trying to read something written there in a language only he could understand. The moment stretched, fragile as spun glass, until someone jostled her elbow and broke the spell. Margot blinked and turned back to her work, her heart beating strangely fast in her chest. When she glanced back toward the door minutes later, the man had moved to the bar, his back to her as he spoke with the bartender. She told herself it meant nothing. Men came and went in the Red Canyon like tumbleweeds on the wind. By tomorrow, he would be gone, and she would still be here, singing songs of heartbreak to men who never truly listened. But she found her gaze drawn back to him throughout the evening, and more than once she caught him looking at her in return. There was something different about him, something in the way he held himself apart from the rowdiness around him, nursing a single whiskey while others poured drink after drink down their throats. He did not gamble, did not seek out female companionship, did not engage in the boisterous camaraderie of the other cowboys. He simply stood there, present but separate, and watched. It should have unnerved her. Instead, Margot found herself intrigued. The evening wore on, the crowd growing louder and more unruly as the night deepened. Margot returned to the stage for another set, her voice rising over the din as she sang a ballad about a woman waiting for a lover who would never return. As she sang, she let her eyes drift to where the stranger stood and found him watching her with an intensity that made her voice catch for just a fraction of a second before she recovered. When the song ended, she made her way toward the bar, telling herself she was only going for more drinks, that it had nothing to do with the man who stood there. But as she approached, he turned to face her fully, and this time she saw the whole of him. He wore the standard gear of a working cowboy, dusty leather chaps over worn denim, a faded blue shirt, and a bandana tied loosely around his neck. A gun belt sat low on his hips, the revolver well maintained but showing signs of use. He was perhaps 24 or 25, she guessed, with a face that was more interesting than handsome, all strong angles and weathered planes. "You have a fine voice," he said, and his words were quiet, meant only for her ears in the chaos of the saloon. Margot had heard similar compliments 1,000 times, usually as a prelude to propositions she had no interest in entertaining. But something in his tone stopped her from delivering her usual deflection. She studied him for a moment, searching for the ulterior motive, the hidden agenda, and found herself confused when she could not readily identify one. "Thank you," she said finally, guardedly. "I mean it," he continued, as if he had sensed her skepticism. "There is real feeling in it, not just technique. You sing like you understand what the words mean." Something in Margot's chest tightened unexpectedly. When was the last time someone had commented on her singing with genuine appreciation rather than as an excuse to get closer to her? She could not remember. "I suppose I do," she said, then immediately wondered why she had admitted such a thing to a stranger. He nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he had suspected. Then, to her complete surprise, he took a small step back and executed a brief but unmistakable bow. It was not mocking, not exaggerated for effect. It was simple and sincere, the kind of gesture a gentleman might make to a lady of quality, not to a saloon girl serving drinks in a mining town. Margot stared at him, utterly thrown off balance. In 3 years of working in the Red Canyon, no man had ever bowed to her. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, felt something crack in the protective shell she had built around herself. "I am Russell Kane," he said, straightening. "I am passing through with a cattle drive, but I wanted you to know that your singing tonight has been the first beautiful thing I have encountered in 6 months on the trail." She should have had a clever response ready, some practiced line to maintain the distance between them. Instead, she found herself saying, "Margot Fletcher," and then, because she seemed to have lost all sense of self-preservation, "Are you staying in White Oaks long?" "A few days, maybe a week, long enough for the herd to rest and the boys to spend their wages." A slight smile touched his lips, softening the hard lines of his face. "Long enough to hear you sing again, I hope." Before Margot could respond, Theodore's voice cut through the moment like a knife. "Margot! Drinks do not serve themselves." She jumped, pulled back to reality with a harsh jolt. Russell Kane's expression tightened at the owner's tone, but Margot was already moving away, back into the familiar rhythm of her work. Yet for the rest of the evening, she felt the ghost of that bow, that unexpected gesture of respect, hovering around her like a promise of something she dared not name. The saloon finally emptied out in the early hours of the morning, leaving behind the wreckage of another wild night. Margot helped the other girls clean up, stacking chairs and sweeping broken glass, her body aching with exhaustion. By the time she climbed the narrow stairs to the small room she shared with another girl named Clara, the first hints of dawn were painting the sky beyond the window. Clara was already asleep, snoring softly in the bed they shared out of economic necessity. Margot changed into her nightdress, washed her face in the basin, and lay down, expecting sleep to claim her immediately as it usually did. Instead, she found herself staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying that brief interaction at the bar. Russell Kane. Even his name sounded solid, dependable, and that bow, that ridiculous, wonderful, completely unexpected bow. She told herself not to read too much into it. He was just a cowboy passing through, and she was just a saloon girl who had happened to catch his fancy for a moment. By next week, he would be gone, and her life would continue in its well-worn groove. There was no sense in building castles in the air over a single kind gesture. But as she finally drifted off to sleep, Margot found herself hoping that Russell Kane would come back to the Red Canyon before his cattle drive moved on. He did come back. The next evening, in fact, arriving earlier than most of the crowd, taking the same spot at the bar. Margot felt her pulse quicken when she saw him, a reaction she firmly told herself was foolish and dangerous. Yet she could not help but be aware of his presence throughout the night, could not help but sing a little better, stand a little straighter, knowing he was watching. During a break between sets, she found herself at the bar again, ostensibly for more drinks, but truthfully hoping for another conversation. Russell turned to her immediately, as if he had been waiting for the opportunity. "You are even better tonight than you were yesterday," he said. "Perhaps you are simply easier to please after 2 nights in a real bed," Margot replied, but her tone was light, teasing rather than dismissive. "I am sleeping in the bunkhouse at the stockyard with 40 other men. I would hardly call that a real bed." His eyes crinkled at the corners with humor. "No, it is definitely the singing." Despite herself, Margot smiled. "Do you flatter all the saloon girls you meet, Mr. Kane, or am I special? Russell, please. And I would not know, as I do not typically spend much time in saloons." He paused, then added quietly, "And yes, you are special." The sincerity in his voice made Margot's breath catch. She was accustomed to false flattery, to empty promises whispered by men who wanted something from her. But Russell spoke with a straightforwardness that suggested he simply said what he meant without artifice or manipulation. "You cannot know that," she said, deflecting because she did not know how else to respond. "You do not know anything about me. I know you sing with your whole heart. I know you have kind eyes even though you try to hide it. I know you deserve better than to be shouted at by men like your boss." He stopped, seeming to realize he had perhaps said too much. "Forgive me. I am not very practiced at conversation, particularly with women. Most of my talking is done to cattle and horses." Margot found herself laughing, a real laugh rather than the practiced trill she used on the floor. "I imagine they are better listeners than most of the men in here." "Considerably," Russell agreed, and they shared a smile that felt like a secret between them. Over the next several days, a pattern developed. Russell came to the Red Canyon each evening, always taking the same place at the bar, always watching Margot with those steady, storm cloud eyes. They spoke when she could steal moments away from her duties, brief conversations that felt more substantial than hours spent in other company. He told her about life on the trail, about the vast stretches of land between Texas and New Mexico, about sleeping under stars, so numerous they seemed close enough to touch. She found herself sharing small pieces of her own story in return, carefully edited but more honest than she had been with anyone in years. Theodore noticed, of course. He noticed everything that went on in his establishment, particularly when it involved his girls and potential paying customers. "That cowboy seems taken with you," he said one night, cornering Margot near the back hallway. "You be sure to encourage him to spend freely. Men with money are good for business." Margot felt something curdle in her stomach at the implication. "He is just a customer like any other." "Then treat him like one. Get him drinking. Get him gambling. That is what you are here for, girl. Do not forget it. She nodded and escaped as quickly as she could, feeling soiled by the exchange. Theodore saw her as nothing more than a tool to separate men from their money, and most days she could accept that as the price of her survival. But something about Russell made her want to be more than that, made her remember the girl she had been before circumstances had forced her into this life. It was Russell himself who brought the situation to a head. On the fifth night of his presence in White Oaks, he waited until Margot's set ended and then approached her with obvious purpose. The saloon was particularly busy, packed with drovers from the cattle drive and miners from the surrounding claims, all of them looking for ways to spend their hard-earned money. Margot, might I speak with you privately for a moment? Russell asked, his voice low. Every instinct told her to refuse. Private conversations with customers led to expectations she had no intention of fulfilling, but this was Russell, who had never been anything but respectful, who looked at her like she mattered. Against her better judgment, she nodded and led him out onto the saloon's back porch, away from prying eyes and listening ears. The night air was cool, a relief after the stifling heat inside. The sounds of the saloon were muffled here, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Margot wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling exposed in her low-cut dress, despite having worn it countless times before. What did you want to speak about? She asked, trying to keep her voice professional, detached. Russell stood a careful distance away, making no move to approach closer. I wanted to ask if you would have dinner with me. Tomorrow evening, before you begin work, there is a restaurant on the main street that looks respectable. Nothing fancy, but better than the bunkhouse food I have been eating. Margot stared at him, certain she had misheard. You want to take me to dinner? If you would be willing. I know it might seem unusual, but I would like the chance to talk with you properly, without the noise and interruptions. He paused, then added, I would be honored if you would say yes. Honored, as if she were doing him the favor. Margot felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. She should say no. Theodore would be furious if he found out. And more than that, letting herself hope for something beyond her current circumstances was a dangerous game that could only lead to heartbreak. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was, yes, I would like that. The smile that broke across Russell's face was like sunrise over the mountains, transforming his weathered features into something approaching joy. Tomorrow evening, then, 6 o'clock, I can meet you here or wherever you prefer. There is a boarding house 2 streets over where I actually live. The saloon has rooms upstairs, but I do not stay there. She surprised herself by offering this information, this small truth about her life. Mrs. Henderson's place. You can call for me there. 6 o'clock at Mrs. Henderson's, Russell confirmed. He looked like he wanted to say more, but instead he simply repeated that small, respectful bow that had undone her that first night. Thank you, Margot. I will see you tomorrow. He went back inside, leaving Margot alone on the porch with her heart racing and her mind spinning. She had just agreed to have dinner with a customer. Theodore would call it good business if it led to more spending. But Margot knew this was different. This was not business. This was personal, real, terrifying in its potential to hurt her. She should back out, send word that she had changed her mind. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But as she returned to the saloon and caught sight of Russell at the bar, his eyes finding hers across the crowded room, Margot knew she would not back out. Could not. Because for the first time in 3 years, someone had seen her. Really, truly seen her. And that was worth any risk. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Margot worked her morning shift, helping Mrs. Henderson with laundry and cooking, earning the discount on her rent that allowed her to afford even the modest room she shared with Clara. Her hands moved automatically through familiar tasks, while her mind raced ahead to the evening, alternating between anticipation and anxiety. Clara noticed her distraction immediately. You have been in the clouds all day. What has gotten into you? Margot hesitated, then decided there was no point in hiding it. Clara would find out eventually anyway. I have been invited to dinner, By who? Clara demanded, her eyes wide. Then, reading Margot's expression, not that cowboy who has been mooning over you all week? Russell Kane, and he has not been mooning. Oh, he most certainly has been. Every girl in the Red Canyon has noticed. Half of them are jealous. Clara grabbed Margot's hands, her own frustrations over laundry forgotten. Is this a real dinner? Like a proper courtship dinner? I do not know what it is, Margot admitted. But yes, a real dinner, at the restaurant on Main Street. Clara squealed and immediately began planning. You cannot wear your saloon dress. That would give entirely the wrong impression. You need to borrow my blue calico, the one with the decent neckline, and we need to do something with your hair, something nice but not too fancy. Margot let herself be swept up in Clara's enthusiasm, grateful for the distraction from her own nervousness. They spent the afternoon preparing, with Clara playing lady's maid and fashion advisor. The blue calico dress was indeed much more appropriate than anything Margot owned, with a modest neckline and clean lines that made her look respectable rather than provocative. Clara pinned Margot's hair up in a simple but elegant style, leaving a few curls loose to frame her face. You look like a proper lady, Clara declared, stepping back to admire her work. Not a saloon girl at all. The words stung more than Clara probably intended. Because that was what Margot wanted, was it not? To be seen as something other than her occupation, to be valued for qualities beyond her voice and her appearance. But wanting it and achieving it were very different things. At precisely 6 o'clock, a knock sounded at the boarding house door. Mrs. Henderson answered it, her sharp eyes assessing Russell Kane from head to toe. He had clearly made an effort himself, his hair neatly trimmed, his shirt clean and pressed, his boots polished. He held his hat respectfully in his hands as he asked for Margot. Mrs. Henderson, normally suspicious of any man calling on her female boarders, seemed mollified by his obvious respect. She called up the stairs for Margot, who descended with her heart in her throat, one hand on the banister to steady herself. Russell's expression when he saw her made the entire afternoon of preparation worthwhile. He stared at her as if she had stepped out of a painting, his eyes wide with something like wonder. You look beautiful, he said simply. Thank you. You look very nice as well. The words felt inadequate, but Margot's vocabulary seemed to have temporarily abandoned her. He offered his arm and she took it, feeling the solid strength of him through the fabric of his shirt. They walked together down the main street of White Oaks, past the assayer's office and the general store, past miners and drovers who tipped their hats or called out greetings. Margot was acutely aware of being seen with Russell, of the speculation that would inevitably follow. But when she glanced up at him, he was looking straight ahead with quiet confidence, as if escorting her to dinner was the most natural thing in the world. The restaurant was called the White Oaks Hotel Dining Room, a modest establishment that catered to the town's more respectable citizens. Margot had walked past it hundreds of times but had never been inside, knowing that saloon girls were not generally welcomed in such places. But Russell held the door open for her, and the hostess seated them without comment at a table by the window. It was only when they were seated, with menus in hand, that the reality of the situation hit Margot. She was on a date, a real, proper date, with a man who treated her with respect and kindness. She did not know how to do this, how to be the kind of woman who had dinner in nice restaurants with gentlemen callers. Are you all right? Russell asked, his brow furrowed with concern. If you are uncomfortable, we can go somewhere else. No, I am fine. Just a bit overwhelmed, I suppose. This is not something I am accustomed to. Having dinner? He looked genuinely confused. Having dinner with someone who actually wants to talk to me, Margot clarified. Most men who pay attention to me at the saloon have very different intentions. Russell's expression darkened slightly. Then most men are fools who cannot recognize quality when they see it. The simple sincerity of his words made Margot's throat tight with emotion. She busied herself with the menu, blinking back tears she refused to let fall. She would not cry on this date, would not reveal how deeply his kindness affected her. They ordered, And when the food came, they talked. Russell told her about growing up on a small ranch in the Texas Panhandle, the son of hardworking parents who had taught him the value of honest labor and treating people with dignity. His father had died 2 years ago, and his mother had sold the ranch and moved to live with her sister in Austin, leaving Russell to make his own way in the world. I have been working cattle drives ever since, he explained. It is hard work, but I am good at it, and I have been saving my wages. I have a plan, you see. What kind of plan? Margot asked, genuinely curious. I want my own ranch someday. Nothing huge, just a few hundred acres with good water and grass, a place where I can build something lasting, something that matters. He paused, then added quietly, a place to build a family. The way he said it, looking directly at her, made Margot's heart skip. Was he implying what she thought he was implying? No, that was impossible. They had known each other less than a week. These were just the dreams of a working cowboy, nothing to do with her. That sounds like a fine dream, she said carefully. What about you? What are your dreams, Margot? The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that in years. She had stopped asking it of herself, stopped allowing herself to dream beyond day-to-day survival. But now, with Russell looking at her with such genuine interest, such real desire to know her answer, she found herself speaking a truth she had buried deep. I want to be seen, she said quietly. Not as a saloon girl, not as a pretty voice or a pleasant distraction. I want someone to see me, the real me, the parts that matter. She laughed, but it came out bitter. I suppose that sounds foolish. It sounds like the most sensible thing I have ever heard, Russell replied. He reached across the table, stopping just short of taking her hand, making the gesture an offer rather than a presumption. I see you, Margot. I have seen you from the first moment I walked into that saloon, and what I see is remarkable. Margot looked at his hand, calloused from years of hard work, steady and strong. Then she made a choice. She placed her hand in his, felt his fingers close gently around hers, and allowed herself to hope. They talked through the entire meal and beyond until the restaurant staff began pointedly clearing nearby tables. Russell walked her back to the boarding house, their conversation flowing easily, punctuated by comfortable silences that felt as natural as breathing. At the door, he released her hand reluctantly. May I see you again? Outside of the saloon, I mean, before I have to leave with the drive. When do you leave? Margot asked, even though part of her did not want to know the answer. The end of the week, 4 more days. He said it regretfully, as if he wished he could change it. 4 days. So little time. But Margot found herself nodding. Yes, I would like to see you again. Tomorrow? We could take a walk if the weather holds. I would like to show you something. Tomorrow, Margot agreed. Russell smiled, then executed that bow again, the one that had first captured her attention. Good night, Margot Fletcher. Thank you for a perfect evening. She watched him walk away, her hand still tingling from his touch, her heart full of a dangerous, wonderful emotion she did not yet dare name. When she went inside, Clara was waiting at the top of the stairs, practically vibrating with curiosity. Tell me everything, Clara demanded, pulling Margot into their room and closing the door. And Margot did, speaking softly in the darkness, as Clara listened with the attention of a devoted audience. She described the dinner, the conversation, the way Russell had looked at her like she was something precious. And for the first time since arriving in White Oaks, Margot allowed herself to imagine a future that looked different from her present. The next 3 days passed in a blur of stolen moments and growing connection. Russell met Margot each afternoon, and they walked through White Oaks and beyond, exploring the surrounding landscape while talking about everything and nothing. He showed her a spot in the foothills where wildflowers grew in defiant splashes of color against the arid ground. She told him about her childhood in Santa Fe, about the mother she had lost to fever, and the father who had tried to sell her into marriage to settle his debts. With each conversation, each shared confidence, Margot felt the walls around her heart crumbling. She had built those walls for protection, but they had also imprisoned her. Russell made her want to be free, to risk vulnerability for the chance at something real. But time was running out. The cattle drive was scheduled to depart at dawn on Sunday, and it was now Saturday afternoon. They sat together on a flat rock overlooking white oaks, watching the town go about its business below them. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. "I do not want to leave tomorrow," Russell said quietly. "Then do not," Margot replied, even though she knew it was not that simple. "I am contracted through to Colorado. The rancher who hired us is depending on getting those cattle to market. I cannot just abandon my responsibilities." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "But I will come back, Margot. As soon as the drive is finished and I have my wages, I will come back to White Oaks. I promise you that." Margot wanted to believe him, but she had heard promises before, from her father, from men who swore they loved her, but vanished when circumstances became difficult. Promises were easy to make and easier to break. "Do not make promises you might not keep," she said, trying to protect herself from the disappointment she felt looming. "I keep my promises," Russell said firmly. "Always. If I say I will come back, I will come back." He took both her hands in his grip warm and sure. "Margot, I know this is fast. I know we have only known each other a week, but I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. You are everything I did not know I was looking for." "Russell," she breathed, torn between hope and fear, "I am not asking you to promise me anything. I know you have your own life, your own decisions to make, but I need you to know that I see you. Not the saloon girl, not the singer, not any of those surface things. I see the woman who dreams of being truly seen, the woman who left everything behind rather than accept a future she did not choose, the woman who is strong and brave and kind even when the world gives her little reason to be. That is who I see. That is who I will come back for." Tears streamed down Margot's face, and she made no effort to hide them. For 3 years she had held herself together through sheer force of will, never allowing herself to break, to feel, to hope too much. But Russell's words had broken through every defense, and she found herself sobbing into his shoulder as he held her gently, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring soft reassurances. When the tears finally subsided, Margot pulled back, embarrassed by her loss of control. But Russell simply wiped her cheeks with his thumbs, his expression tender. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I do not know what came over me. Do not apologize for feeling things. That is one of the things I admire about you. You feel everything so deeply, even when you try to hide it." "I am terrified," Margot admitted. "Terrified of believing you, of hoping this is real, of being disappointed when you do not come back." "I will come back," Russell repeated. "I swear it on everything I hold sacred. I will come back to you, Margot." She looked into his eyes, those storm cloud eyes that had seen her from the very beginning, and made a choice to believe. "Then I will wait for you." Russell smiled, and then slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned in and kissed her. It was gentle, respectful, nothing like the stolen kisses men had tried to force on her at the saloon. It tasted like promise and possibility, like a future that might actually contain happiness. When they finally parted, the sun had set, leaving them in twilight. They walked back to town hand in hand, neither wanting to speak and break the spell. At the boarding house, Russell kissed her once more, then stepped back. "I will be gone before you wake tomorrow. But I will write to you, and I will be back before the summer ends. That gives me 2 months. 2 months to finish this drive and get back to White Oaks. To get back to you." "I will be here," Margot promised. She watched him walk away into the gathering darkness, her heart full of equal parts joy and sorrow. Then she went inside and up to her room, where she lay awake most of the night, replaying every moment of the past week, holding them close like precious gems. Sunday dawned gray and overcast, matching Margot's mood. She went to the Red Canyon that evening with dragging steps, knowing Russell would not be there, that his spot at the bar would be empty. The saloon felt different without his presence, more tawdry, more desperate. She sang her songs with mechanical precision, her heart not in the performance. Theodore noticed and cornered her during a break. "What is wrong with you tonight? You sound like someone died." "Nothing is wrong. I'm just tired." "Well, wake yourself up. That cowboy who was so interested in you is gone, along with his money. Time to set your sights on new prospects." He gestured to the crowded room. "Plenty of possibilities out there." Margot nodded numbly and returned to work, but Theodore's words echoed in her mind. "That cowboy who was so interested in you is gone." As if Russell had been just another customer, another source of revenue. As if what they had shared meant nothing, but it meant everything to Margot, and she would wait as she had promised, even if waiting was the hardest thing she had ever done. The weeks crawled by with agonizing slowness. Margot went through the motions of her life, singing at the saloon, doing her chores at the boarding house, existing in a state of suspended animation. She checked for letters every day, haunting the post office, until the postmaster knew her by sight and shook his head sympathetically when there was nothing for her. Clara tried to keep her spirits up, dragging her on walks and inventing gossip to distract her. But Margot could not shake the growing fear that Russell had been just a beautiful dream, that he would not come back, that she had been a fool to hope. 6 weeks after Russell left, a letter finally arrived. Margot tore it open with shaking hands, right there in the post office, not caring who saw her tears as she read. He wrote about the drive, about difficult river crossings and stampedes in the night, about the endless miles of grassland under vast skies. He wrote about missing her, about counting the days until he could return to White Oaks. He wrote that he was thinking of her every moment, that she was the last thought in his mind before sleep and the first upon waking. He signed it simply, "Yours, Russell." Margot clutched the letter to her chest, her heart soaring. He had not forgotten. He was coming back. She read the letter so many times she memorized it, carrying it in her pocket like a talisman. 2 weeks later, another letter came, and then another 2 weeks after that. Russell wrote faithfully, each letter a lifeline connecting her to him across the miles. Margot wrote back, pouring out her heart on paper in a way she had never been able to do in person. She told him about her dreams, her fears, her hopes for the future. She told him things she had never told anyone, trusting him with pieces of herself she usually kept hidden. It was in her third letter that she made a confession. "I think I am falling in love with you," she wrote. "I did not want to. I tried not to. But the heart does not always listen to reason. If this scares you away, I will understand. But I needed you to know the truth." She sent the letter before she could change her mind, then spent the next 2 weeks in an agony of uncertainty. What if she had revealed too much too soon? What if Russell had simply been lonely on the trail and was now regretting his promises? What if she had just destroyed the best thing that had ever happened to her? But when his next letter came, all her fears evaporated. "I am not scared away," he wrote. "I am honored, humbled, and absolutely certain that I love you too. I think I fell in love with you that first night, when you sang like your heart was breaking, and I saw past the saloon to the real woman beneath. I love you, Margot Fletcher, and I am coming home to you." Margot sat on her bed and cried, but these were tears of joy rather than sorrow. Russell loved her, actually loved her. Not her appearance, not her voice, but her. The real her, the parts that mattered. She began to count the days until his return, marking them off on a calendar Clara had given her. The cattle drive should conclude by late August, Russell had written, and then he would immediately begin the journey back to White Oaks. She could expect him by early September at the latest. August faded into September, and Margot found herself watching the roads into town with obsessive attention. Every rider approaching sent her heart racing, only to plummet when it turned out to be someone else. September 1st passed, then the 5th, then the 10th. Still, Russell didn't come. Doubt began to creep in again. What if something had happened to him? Cattle drives were dangerous. Men died all the time from accidents, illness, stampedes. What if he had been hurt and was unable to send word? Or worse, what if he had simply changed his mind? What if the reality of returning to her, to a saloon girl in a dusty mining town, had lost its appeal? On September 15th, Margot was working the floor at the Red Canyon, her heart heavy with worry, when she heard a commotion at the door. She turned, expecting to see another group of rowdy miners, and instead saw Russell Kane walking through the door, dusty from travel but unmistakably him. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and everything else fell away. Margot did not remember dropping her tray, did not hear it clatter to the floor or the shouts of the men splashed by the spilled drinks. She only knew that she was running, pushing through the crowd, and then Russell's arms were around her, lifting her off her feet, spinning her around as she laughed and cried simultaneously. "You came back," she gasped against his shoulder. "You actually came back." "I promised," Russell said simply, setting her down but not releasing his hold. "I always keep my promises." He kissed her then, right there in the middle of the Red Canyon Saloon, in front of Theodore and the customers and the other girls and everyone. It was not proper, not respectable, not the kind of thing a gentleman did with a lady in public. But Margot did not care. Let them all see. Let them know that someone valued her enough to claim her openly, to kiss her like she was precious, to come back for her, just as he had sworn he would. When they finally broke apart, the saloon had gone almost silent, everyone staring at the spectacle. Theodore's face was purple with rage as he stormed over. "What in the hell do you think you are doing? You just spilled drinks on paying customers. You are supposed to be working, not carrying on with random cowboys." Russell turned to face Theodore, keeping one arm firmly around Margot's waist. "Sir, I apologize for the disruption, but I need to speak with Miss Fletcher. It is important." "She is working," Theodore snapped. "Whatever you need to say can wait until she is off shift. Now get out of my saloon before I have you thrown out." "Actually, I do not think I will be working here any longer," Margot heard herself say. The words came out strong and clear, surprising even herself. "I am quitting, Mr. Gaines. Effective immediately." Theodore sputtered, his face going from purple to near crimson. "You cannot quit. You are contracted through the end of the month." "Then take it out of my final wages. I am leaving." It was reckless, crazy even. Margot had no savings, no other prospects, no plan for what came next. But she had Russell. And in that moment, that was enough. She had spent 3 years being invisible, being looked through and looked past. She would not spend one more moment in a place that saw her as nothing more than a commodity. Russell guided her toward the door, sheltering her from Theodore's continued protests. The other saloon girls watched with expressions ranging from shock to envy, and Margot caught Clara's eye, seeing her friend's delighted grin and enthusiastic nod of approval. They stepped out into the night, and Margot took a deep breath of fresh air, feeling as if she had been released from a prison she had not fully recognized until just now. "That was possibly the most foolish thing I have ever done," she said, but she was laughing. "Or the bravest," Russell countered. He cupped her face in his hands, his expression serious. "Margot, I have been thinking about this the entire journey back, planning what I wanted to say, how I wanted to ask. But seeing you just now, being with you again, I realize there is no perfect way to do this. So I am just going to speak from my heart." He released her and dropped to one knee, right there on the wooden sidewalk outside the Red Canyon Saloon. Margot's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes going wide. "Margot Fletcher, I love you. I love your strength, your courage, your kind heart. I love the way you sing like every word matters. I love that you let me see the real you, the parts you usually keep hidden. I want to spend the rest of my life seeing you, really seeing you every day. Will you marry me? Margot could not speak. Tears were streaming down her face again, but she was nodding frantically, managing to choke out a, "Yes, yes, of course, yes," before pulling Russell to his feet and kissing him again. When they finally separated, both of them laughing and crying at once, Russell produced a simple gold band from his pocket. "It is not fancy. I could not afford anything elaborate, but it is real gold, and it is yours if you will have it." "It is perfect," Margot whispered as he slid it onto her finger. And it was, not because of its monetary value, but because it represented something she had almost given up on: being chosen, being valued, being seen. They spent the next hour walking through White Oaks, making plans and dreaming about the future. Russell had secured work at a ranch 20 miles outside of town, a position that came with a small cabin for married employees. They could be wed within the week if Margot was willing, and then begin their life together. "What about your dream of owning your own ranch?" Margot asked. "That will come in time. For now, I want to build something with you, even if it starts small. We will save together, plan together, work toward that dream together." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "You are my dream now, Margot. Everything else is just details." They were married 5 days later in the small church at the edge of White Oaks, with Clara as maid of honor and a few of Russell's friends from the cattle drive as witnesses. Margot wore Clara's best dress, cleaned and pressed, with wildflowers in her hair that Russell had picked that morning. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Margot felt as if she were being born anew, stepping into a life she had never dared imagine for herself. The ranch where Russell worked was called the Double K, owned by a gruff but fair man named Kenneth Kingston, who had met Russell on the trail and been impressed by his work ethic. The cabin provided for married hands was indeed small, just 2 rooms and a loft, but Margot thought it was the most beautiful place she had ever lived. It had a real stove for cooking, glass windows that let in the light, and a bed that was theirs alone, not shared with roommates or tainted by associations with the saloon. Margot threw herself into making it a home, cleaning and decorating with whatever she could afford or make herself. Russell worked long hours with the cattle, but he came home each evening to her, and that made every moment of hard work worthwhile. They talked over simple dinners, planned for the future, made love with a tenderness that left Margot amazed that such connection between 2 people was possible. The other ranch hands and their families were welcoming, treating Margot as one of them despite knowing about her past. Or perhaps they did not know. Perhaps all they saw was Russell Kane's wife, a young woman working hard to build a life with her husband. The thought that she might be judged simply on her current merits rather than her history was both foreign and wonderful. 3 months into their marriage, Margot realized her monthly courses had not come. She waited another month to be certain before telling Russell, nervous about his reaction. They had talked about children eventually, but not this soon, not when they were still struggling to save every penny toward their dream of a ranch. But when she finally gathered the courage to tell him, Russell's whoop of joy could probably be heard across 3 counties. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing and kissing her face all over until she was breathless with her own laughter. "We are going to have a baby," he kept repeating, as if he could not quite believe it. "A baby, Margot. Our baby." "I thought you might be worried about the cost, about our savings," Margot admitted. "The cost?" Russell looked at her as if she had spoken a foreign language. "Margot, this is not a cost. This is the greatest blessing we could receive. We will figure out the money. We always do. But this child is a gift." His joy was infectious, and Margot found her own nervousness melting into excitement. They were going to be parents. They were going to create a family, something neither of them had truly had in years. It was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though the morning sickness was brutal in the first months. Margot continued working around the cabin as long as she was able, determined to contribute even though Russell insisted she should rest. The other ranch wives took her under their collective wing, sharing advice and hand-me-down baby clothes and offering the kind of female friendship Margot had not experienced since leaving Santa Fe. In early June of 1883, after a labor that lasted from sunrise to sunset, Margot gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Thomas, after Russell's father, with the middle name Fletcher, to honor Margot's family. He was perfect, with a shock of dark hair and Russell's blue-gray eyes, and Margot fell in love with him the moment the midwife placed him in her arms. Russell cried when he held his son for the first time, tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered face as he cradled the tiny bundle with surprising gentleness. "Hello, Thomas," he whispered. "I am your papa, and I promise to do everything in my power to give you a good life, to be the kind of father you deserve." Watching her husband with their child, Margot felt her heart might burst with the fullness of her love. 2 years ago, she had been alone, invisible, singing songs of heartbreak in a saloon where no one truly saw her. Now she had a husband who loved her, a son who depended on her, and a future that stretched out bright with possibility. Life settled into a new rhythm around caring for Thomas. Margot discovered reserves of strength she had not known she possessed, managing the endless demands of an infant while still maintaining their home and supporting Russell's work on the ranch. It was exhausting but fulfilling in ways her old life had never been. Russell was a devoted father, coming home each evening eager to spend time with his son, singing him silly songs and making faces that sent the baby into fits of gurgling laughter. He was also a devoted husband, making sure Margot knew she was still seen, still valued, even amid the chaos of new parenthood. "You are an amazing mother," he told her one evening, as they sat together on the porch, Thomas asleep in Margot's arms. "But you are still you, the woman I fell in love with. Do not lose sight of that." "How could I, when you remind me every day?" Margot leaned against his shoulder, content in a way she had never imagined possible. When Thomas was 6 months old, Kenneth Kingston called Russell into his office. Margot waited anxiously at the cabin, worried that there might be trouble, that perhaps they were being let go. Work on ranches could be uncertain, and winter was coming, which always meant tighter budgets. But when Russell returned, he was grinning ear to ear. "Kingston is expanding his operation. He needs a new foreman, someone he can trust to manage the herds and the men. He offered me the position." "Russell, that is wonderful!" Margot exclaimed. "There is more. The foreman position comes with a significant raise in wages. If we are careful, if we save aggressively, we could have enough for our own small spread within 3 years, maybe 5 at most." Margot stared at him, hardly daring to believe it. Their own ranch, the dream they had talked about since that first dinner in White Oaks. It was actually within reach. 5 years, she repeated. 5 years, Russell confirmed. "We can do this, Margot. We can build the life we dreamed of." They did save aggressively, putting away every spare dollar, making do with less, planning carefully for the future. Russell proved to be an excellent foreman, earning the respect of the men he supervised and the trust of Kingston. Margot took in sewing and laundry work when she could manage it around caring for Thomas, adding her earnings to their growing nest egg. Thomas grew from baby to toddler, walking at 10 months and talking early, a bright and curious child who filled their cabin with energy and laughter. He had Russell's steady temperament and Margot's expressive face, the best of both of them combined into one small person. When Thomas was 2 years old, Margot discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news was met with excitement rather than nervousness, though they both worried about how they would manage with 2 children while still trying to save for their ranch. "We will figure it out," Russell said, echoing his words from before Thomas was born. "We always do." Their daughter, Elizabeth Rose, was born in February of 1885, arriving during a late winter storm that threatened to prevent the midwife from reaching them. But everything worked out, and Elizabeth proved to be as easygoing as her brother had been demanding, sleeping through the night within weeks and smiling at everyone who looked at her. Thomas was initially skeptical of this new addition to their family, but his skepticism melted when Elizabeth grabbed his finger with her tiny hand and held on tight. From that moment, He appointed himself her protector, always wanting to help with her care and telling anyone who would listen about his baby. Life was full, busy, sometimes overwhelming, but always rich with love. Margot had never been happier, even during the exhausting early days of caring for two young children. She had never felt more seen, more valued, more essential. In the spring of 1886, Russell came home one evening with barely contained excitement. Kingston is selling off some of his land, he announced. 500 acres on the eastern edge of his property, with a creek running through it and good grazing. He is offering it to me first at a fair price because he values my work. Margot, we have almost exactly enough saved. They stood in the middle of their cabin, Thomas playing at their feet and Elizabeth sleeping in her cradle, and looked at each other with mingled hope and fear. This was it, the moment they had been working toward for nearly 4 years, the chance to own their own land, to build something lasting, to secure their children's future. Let us do it, Margot said. Let us build our ranch. The process of purchasing the land took weeks, involving lawyers and banks and seemingly endless paperwork. But finally, on a warm day in June, Russell and Margot stood on their own property, holding the deed that proved it belonged to them. 500 acres of New Mexico rangeland, with a creek running clear and cold through the heart of it, under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. "We did it," Russell said, his voice thick with emotion. "We actually did it." Margot could not speak past the lump in her throat, so she simply held his hand and looked out over the land that was theirs, bought with hard work and sacrifice and unwavering commitment to their shared dream. Building the ranch was a monumental task. They lived in a tent on the property while Russell built their house, working every spare moment with the help of friends from the Double K. It was a modest structure, just 3 rooms to start, but it was solid and well made, with space to expand as their family grew. Margot painted the walls herself, sewed curtains for the windows, and planted a garden out front that she watered carefully every day. They started small, with 50 head of cattle purchased with a loan from the bank and an agreement to repay it from their first sales. Russell worked from dawn to dusk, branding cattle, mending fences, managing the land with the skill he had developed over years of hard experience. Margot managed the household, cared for the children, and helped with the ranch work when she could, learning to ride and rope and handle cattle out of necessity. It was hard, harder than either of them had anticipated. There were droughts that parched the grass and killed the creek to a trickle. There were brutal winters when they lost cattle to cold and starvation despite their best efforts. There were lean years when they survived on beans and cornbread and hope, when it seemed like the bank might foreclose and everything they had worked for would slip away. But there were also good years, when the rains came at the right time and the cattle grew fat and the prices at market were favorable. There were moments of triumph, like when they repaid the bank loan in full, or when Russell was able to hire their first hand, or when Margot's garden produced enough vegetables to not only feed their family, but sell the surplus in white oaks. Through it all, they had each other. On the hardest days, when everything seemed to be going wrong, Russell would find Margot and pull her into his arms, reminding her that they had survived worse together. On the best days, when success made them giddy with relief, Margot would remind Russell how far they had come from that first meeting in the Red Canyon Saloon. "Sometimes I cannot believe this is my life," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch of their home, watching Thomas and Elizabeth play in the yard. Thomas was 7 now, already helping with age-appropriate ranch chores, and Elizabeth was 5, a little whirlwind of energy and curiosity. "Why cannot you believe it?" Russell asked. "Because I used to be so invisible, used to feel like I did not matter, like I would never have anything real or lasting. And now I have all of this." She gestured to encompass the ranch, their home, their children. "I have you. I have our family. I have a place where I belong." Russell took her hand, his thumb tracing over her knuckles in the familiar comforting gesture he had repeated thousands of times over their years together. You were never invisible, Margot. You just needed someone willing to really look. And I will never stop looking, never stop seeing you, for as long as I live. In 1888, Margot gave birth to their third child, another son they named Daniel Russell Kane. His arrival was easier than either of his siblings had been, perhaps because Margot was now experienced at childbirth, or perhaps because Daniel was simply an easy baby. He had a calm, peaceful temperament from the start, content to observe the world around him with wide, thoughtful eyes. Thomas and Elizabeth doted on their baby brother, taking turns helping care for him under Margot's watchful supervision. The house was full of noise and laughter and the beautiful chaos of a growing family, and Margot cherished every exhausting, wonderful moment of it. The ranch continued to grow. By 1890, they had expanded their herd to 200 head and hired 3 permanent hands to help manage them. Russell had proven himself a shrewd businessman as well as a skilled rancher, making smart decisions about when to buy and sell, how to manage their resources, when to take risks, and when to play it safe. The ranch, which they had named the KF for Kane and Fletcher, was becoming known in the region for quality cattle and honest dealings. Margot found her own role on the ranch, managing the accounts and handling correspondence, negotiating with buyers, and keeping meticulous records. She discovered she had a head for numbers and a talent for reading people, skills that served them well in business. She also became known for her hospitality, opening their home to neighbors and traveling ranch hands, creating a sense of community in the sometimes isolated landscape of ranching country. On a hot summer evening in 1891, they celebrated their 8th wedding anniversary with a party at the ranch. Friends and neighbors came from miles around, bringing food and drink and music. Someone had brought a fiddle, and there was dancing in the yard as the sun set in spectacular fashion over the mountains. Russell found Margot in the crowd and extended his hand. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Kane?" "You may, Mr. Kane," Margot replied, taking his hand and letting him lead her into the improvised dance floor. They moved together easily, years of partnership making them instinctively aware of each other's rhythms. Margot thought back to that first dinner in White Oaks, how nervous and uncertain she had been, how impossible this future had seemed. And yet here they were, surrounded by family and friends, dancing under the stars on their own land. "What are you thinking about?" Russell asked, reading the expression on her face. "About how you bowed to me that first night in the saloon. How that one gesture changed everything." "I saw something in you worth bowing to," Russell said simply. "I still do, every single day." The years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the milestones of their growing children. Thomas grew into a capable young man, taking on more and more responsibility on the ranch, clearly destined to follow in his father's footsteps. Elizabeth proved to have her mother's voice and her father's business sense, a formidable combination. Daniel was the quiet one, preferring books to branding irons, and Margot encouraged his education, determined that he should have choices about his future. In 1895, when Margot was 34 and Russell 37, they welcomed their 4th and final child, a daughter they named Sarah Margaret. Her arrival was unexpected, as they had assumed their family was complete, but she was welcomed with joy by the entire family. Thomas was 14 and felt himself too grown up to be excited about a baby, but Margot caught him sneaking into the nursery to watch Sarah sleep, his expression soft with protective affection. Elizabeth, at 12, appointed herself as Sarah's special guardian, and Daniel at 7 was delighted to no longer be the baby of the family. Sarah completed their family in a way they had not realized was missing. She had Margot's auburn hair and Russell's blue-gray eyes, and a personality that was somehow both fierce and gentle. She was the child who would grow up knowing only security and love, without memory of the hard early years when their parents had fought to establish the ranch. The new century approached, and with it came changes to White Oaks and the surrounding territory. The silver had mostly played out, and many of the rough miners and gamblers had moved on to other boom towns. The population was more settled now, more families, and fewer fortune seekers. The Red Canyon Saloon had actually closed down years ago, Theodore Gaines moving on to greener pastures, and the building now housed a respectable mercantile. Margot occasionally thought about those years she had spent as a saloon girl, singing to men who looked through her rather than at her. The memories felt like they belonged to someone else, a different woman living a different life. She bore no resentment toward her past. It had shaped her, taught her resilience, and ultimately led her to Russell. Without those hard years, she might never have appreciated the life she now had, might have taken for granted the daily miracle of being truly seen. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1903, Russell surprised Margot with a special gift. He had commissioned a portrait of their family, something they could never have afforded in the early years, but that was now within their means. A traveling artist came to the ranch and spent several sessions painting them all together. Russell and Margot seated, surrounded by their 4 children, with the ranch house visible in the background. When the portrait was complete, Margot stood before it with tears in her eyes. There she was, captured in oil paint for posterity, surrounded by everything she had never dared dream of having. A husband who loved her, children who thrived under her care, a home that was truly hers. And in the portrait, Russell had his hand on her shoulder, and the artist had somehow captured the look in his eyes, that way he had of seeing her, really seeing her, that had never dimmed in 2 decades of marriage. "Do you like it?" Russell asked, coming to stand beside her. "It is perfect," Margot whispered. "It is everything." As the years rolled on, their children grew and began to make their own ways in the world. Thomas married a young woman from a neighboring ranch and took over the day-to-day management of the KF, building his own house on the property with his father's help. Elizabeth, to everyone's surprise, became a teacher in White Oaks, commuting to town and boarding there during the week, returning home on weekends with stories about her students. Daniel did indeed pursue education, eventually attending college in Las Cruces and becoming a lawyer. And Sarah, the baby, proved to have her mother's singing voice and her father's cowboy heart, a combination that made her equally at home performing at church socials and helping with cattle drives. In 1910, Russell and Margot became grandparents for the first time when Thomas and his wife had a son. The experience of holding that tiny baby, knowing he carried their bloodline forward, was profound in ways Margot had not anticipated. She thought of her own mother, long dead, and wished she could have known about this legacy, these generations that would continue long after Margot herself was gone. "We did good," Russell said that evening, watching Margot rock their grandson. "We did very good," Margot agreed. The ranch continued to prosper under Thomas's management, expanding and modernizing with the times while maintaining the core values Russell and Margot had established. The KF became one of the most respected operations in the region, known for fair dealing and quality stock. Russell and Margot gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operations, spending more time enjoying the fruits of their decades of labor. They traveled occasionally, visiting Daniel in Las Cruces and taking a trip to Santa Fe that allowed Margot to make peace with the city of her childhood. They spent long evenings on their porch, watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing, their conversation as easy and natural as it had been in those early days of courtship. "Do you ever regret it?" Margot asked one evening. "Tying your life to a saloon girl from White Oaks?" Russell looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "Regret it? Margot, marrying you was the single best decision I ever made. You gave me a life worth living, a family I adore, a partnership that has made every challenge bearable and every triumph sweeter. How could I possibly regret that?" "I suppose when you put it that way," Margot said, smiling, despite the emotion tightening her throat. "Besides, you were never just a saloon girl. You were always so much more than that. I just had the good sense to see it when others did not." In 1915, they celebrated their 32nd wedding anniversary, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and friends. The party was held at the ranch, with people coming from across the territory to celebrate. There was music and dancing, and at one point someone convinced Margot to sing. She had not performed publicly in years, but she agreed. Her voice perhaps not as strong as it had been in her youth, but still true and filled with feeling. She sang a ballad about enduring love, about promises kept, and dreams realized. And as she sang, she looked at Russell. He was 58 now, his dark hair liberally streaked with gray, his face deeply lined from decades of sun and wind. But his eyes were unchanged, those storm cloud eyes that had first seen her, really seen her in a crowded saloon all those years ago. When the song ended, Russell rose from his chair and walked to where she stood. Then, in front of all their family and friends, he executed that same small, respectful bow he had given her that first night, the gesture that had started everything. The crowd erupted in applause and laughter, but Russell and Margot barely heard them. They were lost in each other's eyes, in the memory of young people falling in love and the reality of a lifetime built together. "I see you, Margot Kane," Russell said softly. "I have always seen you, and I always will." "I know," Margot replied, her heart full to bursting. "That is the greatest gift you ever gave me. Not the ranch, not the security, not even our children, as much as I treasure all of those things. The greatest gift was seeing me when no one else did, making me visible when I felt invisible." They danced then, moving slowly to a new tune the fiddler struck up, and Margot rested her head against Russell's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Around them swirled their children, their grandchildren, their friends, all the people who populated the rich, full life they had built together. The years continued their inevitable march. More grandchildren arrived, filling the ranch with noise and energy. Russell and Margot grew older, their steps slower, but their love undiminished. They remained partners in every sense, making decisions together, supporting each other through the challenges of aging, celebrating every milestone their children and grandchildren achieved. In the winter of 1920, Russell caught pneumonia. Despite the best efforts of the doctor brought from White Oaks, he weakened steadily. Margot refused to leave his side, sitting by his bed day and night, holding his hand and telling him stories about their life together, reminding him of every precious memory they had accumulated. "Do you remember that first night?" she asked him during one of his lucid moments. "When you walked into the Red Canyon and looked at me like I was the only person in the room?" Russell's grip on her hand tightened slightly. "How could I forget? That was the night I found the other half of my soul." "You saved me," Margot whispered. "No," Russell corrected gently. "We saved each other." He died 3 days later, with Margot holding his hand and their children gathered around his bed. He was 63 years old, and he left behind a legacy of integrity, hard work, and above all, love. Margot was 59, and for the first time in nearly 40 years, she was alone. The grief was profound, crushing in its intensity. Margot moved through the days in a fog, going through the motions of living but feeling hollowed out inside. Her children were wonderfully supportive, never leaving her alone for long, making sure she ate and slept and continued to engage with life. But they could not fill the Russell-shaped hole in her heart. It was Sarah, her youngest, who finally broke through the fog. She found Margot one afternoon, sitting in Russell's favorite chair on the porch, staring out at the ranch without really seeing it. "Mama, I know you are hurting. We all are. Papa was everything to all of us. But you taught us to keep living, to keep moving forward even when things were hard. You cannot give up now." "I am not giving up," Margot protested weakly. "I am just resting." "You are disappearing," Sarah said bluntly. "You are becoming invisible again, the way Papa said you were before he met you. And that is not what he would want. He would want you to live fully, to enjoy the grandchildren, to continue being seen and valued and present." Her words struck Margot like a physical blow. Sarah was right. She was retreating into herself, becoming invisible again, letting grief erase her. And Russell would hate that. He had spent 40 years making sure she was seen, making sure she knew her value, making sure she lived fully and openly. To disappear now would dishonor everything he had given her. So Margot made a choice. She chose to keep living. Not just existing, but actually living, engaging with her family and her community, continuing to be present and visible. It was hard, especially at first, but it became easier with time. She found purpose in her grandchildren, in helping manage the ranch, in being a matriarch to the family she and Russell had created. She lived another 15 years, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1935 at the age of 74. She was surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great grandchildren, the legacy of that choice she had made so long ago to believe in Russell's promise to return, to take a chance on love even when it seemed impossible. At her funeral, held at the ranch under a sky as blue and vast as the one she had stood under with Russell on their first day on their own land, her children shared stories. Thomas talked about her strength and resilience. Elizabeth spoke of her wisdom and kindness. Daniel praised her sharp mind and business acumen. And Sarah sang, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd, singing the same ballad Margot had sung at their anniversary party years ago. They buried her next to Russell, under a cottonwood tree, near the creek that ran through the property, the place they had always said was the most beautiful spot on the ranch. The headstone was simple, bearing both their names and dates, and a single line Russell had once said to her that she had never forgotten. I see you. The KF ranch continued under Thomas's management and eventually passed to his children, remaining in the Kane family for generations. The story of how it started, of a saloon girl who just wanted to be seen and a cowboy who looked her in the eye and bowed, became family legend, told and retold to each new generation as an example of what real love looked like. Because in the end, that was what it had all been about. Not the ranch, not the success, not the material prosperity they had achieved. It had been about two people seeing each other truly, completely, without illusion or pretense. It had been about respect and partnership and choosing each other every single day. It had been about a young woman who sang her heart out in a dusty saloon, hoping someone would notice, and a young cowboy who had the wisdom to really look to see past the surface to the remarkable woman beneath. Their great-great-grandchildren would eventually inherit copies of that portrait painted so long ago, hanging it in their own homes as a reminder of where they came from. And looking at it, they would see a woman who looked content, fulfilled, surrounded by family, her eyes bright with the knowledge that she was seen, valued, loved. Next to her stood a man whose hand rested protectively on her shoulder, whose expression spoke of pride and love and unwavering devotion. That portrait, like the story it represented, became a touchstone for the family, a reminder that sometimes the best things in life come not from seeking fortune or fame, but from having the courage to truly see another person and the wisdom to let yourself be seen in return. It stood as testament to a simple truth that Russell and Margot had proven over 4 decades together, that being seen, really seen by the right person, can change everything. It can transform loneliness into belonging, desperation into hope, and a chance meeting in a saloon into a love story that echoes through generations. The Red Canyon Saloon was long gone, replaced by progress and time. White Oaks itself eventually faded from its mining boom days into a quieter existence. The Wild West that Russell and Margot had known became history, replaced by automobiles and electricity and a modern world they would barely recognize. But the KF Ranch remained, a living legacy built on hard work and faith and the kind of love that sees past surfaces to recognize true worth. And somewhere, in the way the wind moved through the cottonwood trees over their graves, in the laughter of their descendants playing in the yard of the house they had built, in the stories passed down through the family, Russell and Margot Kane lived on, their love story continuing to inspire and guide those who came after. It had started with a song and a bow, with eyes meeting across a crowded room, with one person finally really seeing another. And from that simple beginning had grown something extraordinary, something that proved that even in the hardest circumstances, even in a place as rough and unforgiving as the Old West, love could flourish. Real love, the kind that sees and values and endures. the kind that changes everything, the kind that lasts forever.